It's time for All Church Sunday School.
Woo!
And we're glad you're here with us. We're finishing out 2020. Thank you, Lord, for that.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about what comes next for us. And so Jamie and I have been, Jamie Plunkett,
Hello.
friends. Jamie and I have been sort of debating what could we do next? What would be as interactive as possible? Because we like it best when we hear from you all.
Yes.
And we're all sharing information together. If we can't all be in a room together having Sunday school, at least we can simulate that by being interactive and asking you questions, and you're so kind to answer those questions. So we thought it might be really great to just all of us read one of the Gospels together. And the lectionary is turning to the Gospel of Mark. The lectionary is a calendar of how the church moves through Scripture over a series of years, and it's time for Mark's Gospel to come up. So we thought, how much fun would it be for all of us to have Mark open in front of us and just move from the beginning to the end and share what we're learning and consider some other resources. Does that sound good to you?
It sounds great. The Gospel of Mark is a really wonderful place to start as we kind of enter into this
The
new
oldest
season.
of the Gospels, the shortest of the Gospels, the most puzzling in many ways.
Yes.
But it reads like man on the scene reporting.
It is very much like the shorthand version.
Yeah. It's
the
action
immediate
packed.
version.
It's action packed, and there's been a lot of interest, recent interest in the way that Mark reads so well as a story
Yes.
from beginning to end, and doesn't get bogged down in the kind of details that the other Gospels have. And so if that sounds okay to all of you, we hope that you're prepared when we get to the end of this conversation that'll just be sort of introductory, that you will be prepared to read along with us the Gospel of Mark and enjoy the adventure together. I know that Jamie's done a little bit of research. First, I want to show you, Jamie, something, and everybody else. This idea of the four evangelists, as I was looking at art around who wrote the Gospels and how has that been captured by classic artists over the centuries, I came upon this picture that gave us a good opportunity to talk about symbols, not just for the writer of Mark, but for all four Gospels. This is a painting by Rubens. You will see the notation there of the four evangelists. And Jamie, I'm going to ask you if you can find in this picture the symbols that go along. All right. So Saint Mark is always symbolized. The writer of Mark is always symbolized as a winged lion. In the Rubens painting, where do you see a lion?
So the gentleman that's in green has a lion resting underneath his chair.
A very quiet.
It reminds me a lot of where my bull mastiff sits when I'm at home. Just
Under your chair like that?
Directly underneath people. Yeah, that's where.
All right. So Mark is winged lion. Matthew is often shown as a winged man or an angel.
So that one's pretty clear right there, front and center. The winged angel over Matthew's shoulder.
The inspiration for what he's writing, what he's working on. All right. Luke is a winged ox or bull.
This one's kind of fun because you think of a bull or an ox as like this massive creature, especially if it has wings, and you can kind of just see him peeking out right there in the bottom left-hand corner of the picture.
Underneath the blue cloak on the person to the left. Yes. Once again, kind of laying there like a dog taking a nap or looking up. And finally, John is represented by an eagle.
Yes, and you can see the eagle kind of in the top right corner. I love that. I love that this photo has John kind of separated from the other three.
Explain why that might be.
We talk all the time about the synoptic gospels, so the three gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke being very similar in the way that they tell the story, the actual stories about Jesus that they tell, and then the Gospel of John is kind of this cousin of the other three gospel stories where it varies quite a bit. We see a lot in the Gospel of John that is unique to the Gospel of John compared to the other three. And so it's always kind of thought of as like the fourth gospel. And here in the photo or in the painting, John is not sitting at the table with the rest of them, dressed very different from the rest of them, and staring in a completely different direction.
Looking up at the eagle. His skin tone is different. It's almost like, you know, the table where the cool kids sit at lunch in the cafeteria. And then John, nobody invited John to sit down with them. It's just very interesting. This painting is from 1614.
He's carrying his manuscript to the next table down.
It makes me think about what was the information that the artist had as he began to paint and to represent. I just love this particular beautiful masterpiece, but it's very interesting. I can see that you're caught up in it too.
Well, it looks kind of like Matthew's holding a ballpoint pen, which didn't exist at the time. But
well, that's an interesting detail.
Anywho, it's a fun painting. I enjoy that.
I think that you as a docent in a famous museum would be interesting walking along with you,
People
Jamie.
would not learn a lot of useful things.
You would say, look, doesn't that look like a ballpoint pen?
I wonder if they had a time machine.
So here's something else that I found as we as we dive into the Gospel of Mark. There was a lot of controversy over the last decade about this picture, about this scrap, a fragment of the Gospel of Mark, and how old it was, and was it authentic or not. And there were big headlines in 2018, about the middle of the year, because it had finally been dated to the end of the 2nd century or the beginning of the 3rd century, making it the oldest existing fragment of the Gospel of Mark ever found. And I love looking at pictures, seeing, just imagining the Gospel as it existed right at the beginning, and how it was told and how it was shared. And apparently it was very interesting. Now, the oldest, I know you're wondering this, the oldest fragment, any fragment from the New Testament, the oldest one they found so far would be 125 Common Error, and it's a piece of John's Gospel.
It is. Okay. Excellent.
So maybe that's why John had that attitude in that painting we just looked at. He was like,
gosh, second to the party.
So that's the oldest one we have, but this is end of 2nd century. Very, very old. One of the things that I love about a good study Bible is seeing the kind of detective work. Does it ever feel like as you're leaning into the study of a book in the Bible that you're following in the footsteps of scholarly detectives who've been asking lots of questions and trying to figure out and looking at the words and the way the sentences go together, and what clues do we get about the time it was written, who wrote it, looking at the language to say, that's really not Paul's writing.
Right.
That's one of the followers of Paul, that kind of detective work. I just want to encourage everybody, if it's been a while since you bought yourself a new study Bible, the scholarship gets better and better. And even if you have your favorite, you don't have to discard it.
No.
How many study Bibles do you think that you have?
I have 2 that I use pretty regularly. But in total, probably 7 or 8.
There are a lot of different perspectives. The study Bible that I used for the information I'm about to share is very different. This is HarperCollins Study Bible, very different than the NIV Study Bible, that I have.
Oh, excellent.
Different scholars, different perspective on Scripture.
Yes.
It's not all the same information, and I think there's something rich and rewarding about a deep dive, about some detective work.
Absolutely.
Do you think?
I think it's wonderful. So yours is HarperCollins. I have a HarperCollins version that I use pretty frequently as well. This one, this is my go-to. This is my number one. It's the New Interpreter's Study Bible, but it is also NRSV, as HarperCollins is as well. I think study Bibles are so valuable because of the level of thought and care that goes into creating all of those footnotes and all of the academics and all of the wisdom and all of the, interpreting from the original language into the new language and analyzing and breaking down each and every word. That is a lot. That is a labor of love to put a study Bible together. It's why I really love that we give our graduating high school seniors a study Bible to take off to college with them, because it opens up an opportunity to experience a new perspective on scriptures that they've come to know so well. But you mentioned this idea of investigating and kind of journeying through understanding. We just finished a couple weeks ago a series with our high schoolers called Same Story, Different Book, where we explored some of the same stories that are in the 4 different Gospels to ask ourselves, what new perspective does each Gospel lend? And so when we start to talk about Mark and some of those specific stories as we get down this road a little bit, I would really encourage the people watching, I would encourage all of you to go and find where these stories rest in the other Gospels if they're there. And just ask yourself, what is new and different about the way that the story is told in Luke or in Matthew, or if it's in John as well? What is new about the story, and what is different? And how can that provide us a different meaning as well?
So I bet your group loved that kind of Same Story, Different Book.
It was fun to say.
They probably got better at
They got better at investigating, definitely,
yeah.
as we
That's
went
great.
throughout the series. But Addison and I alternated leading those conversations each week, and I so enjoyed leading the conversation on the feeding of the 5,000, because there are only 7 or 8 stories that appear in all 4 Gospels.
All 4, yes.
And that's one of them.
Anytime a story appears in all 4, we should pay attention.
Pay very close attention. And so it's just fun to see how each author tells the story a little bit differently, the details that they choose to include or not include. In one of the versions of the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus basically just takes a kid's lunch. And that's how he feeds all of these masses of people. But it is just so fun to kind of put your Sherlock Holmes hat on and get your magnifying glass out and really start to explore.
And practice some curiosity and know that each gospel has a personality and a point and a purpose that is unique to that gospel.
Absolutely.
So I'm looking forward to the weeks ahead with the Gospel of Mark.
Me too.
So I wanted to share at least how the HarperCollins Study Bible sets up what we know about Mark and what we don't know about Mark. And so there's a section in the introduction to the gospel that says setting, date, and occasion.
Okay.
So let me, the conclusions are drawn by actual examples of Scripture.
Okay.
For the setting, the scholars write, the writer of Mark presumes that readers will be unfamiliar with Jewish customs, Aramaic terms, and Palestinian geography.
Interesting.
So that's what they're discerning by what is said in the Gospel of Mark. And I thought I would just give you an example of the kind of verse that gave them those clues. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
So they are claiming that the reader of Mark would be unfamiliar with Jewish customs. And for that conclusion, they point to Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. Would you read that to us?
Sure. Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders.
So the writer of Mark stops to explain. Mm-hmm. And that gives us a clue that the readers that were intended to read this gospel would need that explanation.
Yes.
They wouldn't automatically know it.
Why is that a big deal?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's how. So they clearly needed more help when it came to Jewish customs. Mm-hmm. The next thing is they were unfamiliar with Aramaic terms. And an example of that comes from the 5th chapter of Mark. Would you read that for us?
Yes. Then Jesus put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, get up.
So, see, there's an explanation there because the reader would need some translation, would not be familiar with an Aramaic term.
Think of it almost as a subtitle.
Then finally, we think these are people who weren't, the readers were people who weren't familiar with Palestinian geography, and we assume that in part because of another verse in Mark 7.
Then Jesus returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis.
So when the writer of the gospel stops and adds some detail, it's revealing to scholarly detectives
Yes.
who the gospel was intended for.
Exactly.
These people are going to need an explanation. It would be like if someone went with me to an Aggie game. I would have to explain
An
some
outsider.
things.
Hello.
An outsider would go with me to an Aggie game. I would, clearly, you're not aware of these customs, and I would explain all of those customs, right?
Yes, you would explain, and I would still scratch my head and say, why do Aggies do this?
These are very strange people. So
Yes.
knowing that we were just kind of stopping, tapping the brakes. So the setting for the Gospel of Mark presumes that readers will be unfamiliar with Jewish customs, Aramaic terms, and Palestinian geography. So here's the conclusion. This suggests an origin beyond Palestine, perhaps Syria, Italy, or somewhere else in the Roman Empire, which immediately, to me, is more interesting.
Yes.
That there's a distance going on.
When you consider how early it was written and how far the story of Jesus orally had already traveled, it's very intriguing to say, okay, the story has made it so far and has carried so much weight that people miles and miles and miles and miles and miles away are starting to write it down.
The news, yes, the news is being captured at a distance. So look at the next slide, and that first was setting. Next comes date, which you just mentioned. Would you read that to us?
Absolutely.
On the left side is the facts that have been discerned in the detective work, and on the right side of the slide is the conclusion drawn from that.
Okay. So if the upheaval forecast in chapter 13 connects with the experience of Mark's readers, then the gospel follows Nero's persecution of Christians in the year 64 and the Jewish revolt against Rome in 67 to 70.
So just looking at the way that Jesus was already, the pushback in the Gospel of Mark to Jesus' ministry and those who were following him,
Yes.
what the reaction was to that ministry tells us gives us some dates.
Yes,
Would make
context
sense between 64 and 70.
Of course.
All right, now let's look at the occasion and read that for us.
A dating in the late 60s would align with Mark's emphasis on the conflict experienced by Jesus and his followers, establishing Mark as the earliest of the New Testament Gospels and a source for Matthew and Luke, written toward the end of the first century.
Now you've got some detective work to share with us.
Yes. So the wonderful thing about having the same Bible for a really long time is that you maybe put sticky notes in it like I do, and there aren't nearly as many sticky notes in here as there used to be, but when I opened to the Gospel of Mark as we prepared to record today, I found two.
Oh, that's not from
These are not from
last
today.
week?
These are from probably when I was still in seminary. And it's just fun to go back and look at some of that stuff. But this sticky note right here, this one, is the one that we're going to focus on because
This is
it
like that
talks.
fragment of Mark's Gospel from the second century.
And if we do some ink dating here and checking on the paper, it looks like it's probably from around 2014. But so we talk a little bit about, and you mentioned it in your last slide, the relationship between Mark and Matthew and Luke. So we can date Mark as being the earliest of the four Gospels written, or at least before Matthew and Luke. And when we start to look and compare the context or the content of Mark with the content of Matthew and Luke, we see some striking similarities. The Gospel of Mark is 50% of the Gospel of Matthew. And the Gospel of Matthew includes 90% of the Gospel of Mark. And when you get to Luke, the Gospel of Mark makes up 30% of the Gospel of Luke, and Luke includes 50% of the Gospel of Mark. So it's pretty clear, just based on those numbers, that the authors of Matthew and Luke were drawing a lot of their stories from the Gospel of Mark. It also means, though, that there was another source out there somewhere, because there are portions of Matthew and Luke that are similar to one another that don't
That
appear
aren't
in
in
Mark.
Mark,
And
yes.
so scholars believe that there's at least one extra source out there that Matthew and Luke worked from, and we call that the Q source. Quella is the German word that means source. Really creative there. So there's a unique relationship between Mark and the other Gospels because it kind of acts as a springboard for what Matthew and Luke do. And there are some moments too that we'll get to down this road where we see some kind of segues that are a little disruptive or things that seem a little rough, that we hear those same stories again in Matthew and Luke, but they've been smoothed out a little bit. They're a little bit more fine-tuned when we get to those two gospel versions. I do love the Gospel of Mark, though, for its brevity. And like you've mentioned already, too, the fact that it is providing so much context as far as geography and language and Jewish culture goes, or Jewish religious beliefs go, tells us as readers that this was meant for a wide audience. And when we talked about this with our high schoolers and we talked about the perspectives of each of the four Gospels, we talked a lot about the Gospel of Mark makes sure that people know that Jesus is for everyone and that the context of this, the message that Jesus has is not applicable just to one group or another, but it is really intended for everyone to receive and hear about. And so just those little symbols that we are going to encounter throughout the book kind of
I
shed
think
light on
by
that.
the time that we get to the end of our time in the gospel, there may be some reasons why this moves up on my list to my favorite gospel because, Luke has fallen by the wayside because of our study
Sure.
of the
It's okay. I think
parables. Now Luke is down a little bit. So what I think that Mark is a compelling voice with its own personality. Now, it may seem like in our conversation today, we're kind of in the weeds, and Jamie and I want to assure you that we're going to get started with the actual reading of the gospel and not talking about reading the gospel
Yes.
in our next class. We just wanted to give you a chance to know where we were headed and to go find your favorite study Bible or maybe invest in an additional one and get ready, because I think there's so much amazing
Yes.
information and inspiration that we're going to get from reading this together. And we want to hear from you all as you are moving through the same territory with us. What else do you want to say about Mark?
I think that we're going to see some themes that are really powerful throughout this gospel. I would love to encourage people as you start to get into the Gospel of Mark to look for places where this theme of secrecy occurs. This is my favorite theme in the Gospel of Mark, is where Jesus does something really powerful and cool, and then the person he's interacting with, he gives them instruction, don't tell anybody that I did this. Because that's a trend throughout the gospel. So the secrecy that takes place, especially at the front end of Mark, is just really, really intriguing.
And it's Mark's format for the reader to know what the people in the story are clueless about.
Yeah.
We're on the inside as we read Mark's gospel.
Yes.
And the people interacting with Jesus are in the dark. And that's kind of a fun way to review the story, to have that inside information of what's really going
All right,
on.
we're in the inner circle.
So
We know what's
I think
going on.
Mark probably makes the disciples look more clueless than any other gospel, don't you think?
I think so. It's really fun
that-
though. It's kind of
we
like
can resonate with that.
it's kind of like a murder mystery movie or something, or like a really dramatic movie where the viewer gets a clue early on about something that's going on, and then you can kind of track.
You're sort of watching it.
And so you're ahead of the characters in the movie, and they're still working to figure it out, but you've already kind of solved the problem. You're like, oh, I already know
See, this
what's
is
going
good.
on here.
I can hardly wait to get
I'm
started.
excited.
Well, what I thought we would do, rather than all of us reading the whole first chapter,
Yes.
just to get our feet wet and to get started, what if we began with Mark chapter 1, verses 1 through 14?
Perfect.
That gives us the introduction. That gives us a chance to talk about how Mark sets the story in motion and what is very particular to Mark. And then we're going to let Mark's story inspire us. I would just also suggests that John the Baptist is going to be part of next week. So you might just do a little detective work on John the Baptist.
Who is
a
that
very
guy?
interesting character. And then, just so you remember, we want to hear from you anytime you have an aha moment in your reading or something that you have discovered, a little nugget about John the Baptist you want to share with everybody else. Please let us hear from you. ACSS, All Church Sunday School, at uccftw.com is the way that you communicate with us.
Absolutely.
We are so excited all together reading the Gospel of Mark. I can't wait to get started.
You know what I would love to hear? As people are exploring about John the Baptist and learning, I would love to. I am a big sports fan. We know this. I would love to hear people's like gospel power rankings. Like, if you had to rank the Gospels 1 through 4, where is Mark in those
Gospel
1 through 4?
power rankings.
Like, Luke is the best gospel, and these are the reasons why. I don't like Matthew at all, and these are the reasons why. I kind of want to hear where Mark falls. Is it your favorite? Is it number 2 or number 3? Is it your least favorite? I just kind of want to know where we're starting
As
this
we're
journey.
beginning, and then we'll see where we are at the end of
Exactly.
it.
Then we can reevaluate.
That makes sense.
You know, I mean, college football, the rankings come out every week. Teams move up and down, so we can kind of track where did Mark
Don't you
start
think the
this
Aggies
journey.
should be number 4?
I don't believe so. No.
Jamie,
But by the time that people
I
are
think
watching
we
this,
need to close this. Well, yeah,
by the
I guess
time,
it's
you
too
know,
late now.
We'll know the final results by the time that this airs. So.
Yes, tell us what your favorite gospel is. We would love to hear that, and we can't wait to get started. We hope that you will be just as enthused as we are about this amazing Gospel of Mark, starting with our next class. We'll see you then. Bye.